Well, this is our last panel for the day, and I think a very interesting one, because automation is an area that is a factor that needs to be considered, certainly in the spacecraft we fly today, but as we take on more commercial users and commercial spacecraft, it has to be a consideration on how we operate. Also, when we look at going back to the moon, under the concept that NASA is pursuing on Artemis and Gateway, automation and automated control is a major factor in how they ought to operate, or how they should operate. So we were very fortunate to have Steve Robinson as our moderator today. Steve is a veteran of 4 shuttle flights and is a professor at University of California, Davis. And I won't say any more about him, as he was introduced by Bonnie. He also was on the education panel. And he's got a very good panel put together that I think you'll find very interesting. So let me turn it over to Steve.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abbey. It's an honor to be here. And with everybody there, thanks for tuning in on your Saturday, and for the Baker Institute sponsoring us here. Well, we're coming to you from all over the country here. We've got really an incredible panel, starting with Captain Bill Shepard, who I don't think is signed in yet, but hopefully he will, who's a retired astronaut, U.S. Navy SEAL retired. We've got Dr. Allie Anderson, professor at CU Boulder, Dr. Sandra Stankovic, research professor at Harvard, Dr. Jennifer Dow, medical director of the National Park Service in Alaska, and quite a few other titles too. Master Sergeant Tamer Barkouki, who's a PhD student at UC Davis in the Center for Spaceflight Research, also a USA Air Force Reserve Pararescue team leader. And Dr. Annika Rollick, who is the director of engineering at Aurelia Institute in Boston, recently graduated with her PhD from CU Boulder. And finally, Captain Jim Weatherby, the world's finest rock and roll drummer. He has some other credentials as well. He's got quite a bit of experience as an astronaut and a U.S. naval aviator. And so what I'd like to do is start with talking about not just automation, but autonomy. This is the word of the day, I would say, in this panel, where automated systems execute pre-programmed behavior, while autonomous systems are able to engage in unprecedented and unplanned decisions and actions. But that doesn't mean unapproved. For spaceflight, especially human spaceflight, we always want humans, whether they're onboard crew, in mission control, or on a surface base, a lunar or Mars base. We want humans involved in the decision-making that autonomous systems recommend to us, especially as the gatekeeper for anything safety critical. And, in human spaceflight, what isn't safety critical? So we refer to these systems as semi-autonomous, and these are the systems I want to talk about today, I want to address today. So I'm going to go down in order, and just for the audience, so you know, I have given a customized specific question to each of our panel members, which they may choose to address or may not, may speak about other things, just to get things started. And let me check here. Doesn't look like Shep has been able to join yet.
His avatar is at the Baker Center.
Shep, your avatar looks so much like you. It's hard to believe. Well, wonderful. Bill Shepard is an American former Navy SEAL, aerospace, ocean, and mechanical engineer, former astronaut, served as commander of the very first ISS Expedition 1. And Shep, I'll turn it over for you to self-introduce and give your statement, and then we'll follow that pattern through the rest of the panel.
So Steve, could you, I think all the people who have been part of the symposium so far, I was introduced yesterday, so I won't dwell on it, but could you repeat the question, please? And
oh, sure.
Yeah.
You bet. You may or may not choose to answer this one, but the question I asked you was for near future, deep space operations, what is the best, meaning the safest and most efficient way to allocate responsibility between humans and autonomous systems?
What is the way to do that? Is that right?
Yeah. What's the best way to allocate the responsibility? So
Well,
how do we decide who does what?
Yeah, let's peel that back one more layer. In the world of trying to design, build and operate a space vehicle or even a space program, you need a way to allocate what are all the functions and the physical entities that are going to be part of the space vehicle or the program. Which physical thing has what function? And so this is it seems like a simple issue, but it's really complex, because when we talk to an industry partner or a contractor to go build something, we give them a statement of what they are to do, and this really becomes a mixture of the physical and the functional. We do not have a way to map the functions that we need into the physical entities that are going to get them done. And we think we're good at it, but we're really not. We're very poor at it. And this is the root of being able to decide what humans should do, what the machines should do by themselves, and then maybe what these two players, if you will, should do cooperatively. And until we fix this problem, we're going to continue to thrash about with systems that operators are unhappy with, and vehicles and programs that are less than completely successful because we have not solved this problem. And Steve, that's my holy grail, if I might offer that up. I pass the mic.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you, Shep, and I'm going to ask you for examples of how should we approach fixing that. So please think about that. I'll get back to you, okay? All right, next up is Professor Allie Anderson. She's an assistant professor of aerospace engineering sciences at the CU Boulder. She's a close colleague of mine in a number of different research projects funded by NASA. She's a very important player in the NASA research world for human performance in space. Her research includes EVA, alternative reality technologies for spaceflight applications, neuro-ocular syndrome, and human resilience in isolated, confined, and extreme environments. So, Allie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here on the panel, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to chat with you all. So the question that Steve had posed to me is a big one, worthy of about 12 PhD student theses, but I'll try my best to say something mildly intelligent. So the question was, for deep space, long-duration habitats, how will we assess an astronaut's ability to accomplish a human autonomous robotic system teaming task, especially for safety-critical operations? And what aspects do we need to assess? And how might astronaut crews learn to trust an autonomous system? So I thought the phrasing was interesting in that there is this idea of, like, specifically the ability to accomplish a task. And that incorporates so many dimensions, such as the skill of the individual, their physical and mental states, as well as the resources to be able to do the task. And so I think that there's a lot of ways that autonomous systems, whether they be robotic or embedded algorithmic systems, that can facilitate safety critical operations without a great degree of controversy. So things like figuring out scheduling, what are the resources, what are the supplies and equipment, generating procedures and facilitating the task performance. I think some of those are clear ways where AI can help and maybe less controversial. I think the most controversial dimension of that question is really this idea of assessing the individual's capability via assessing their skill and physical or mental states. And so I think that there is maybe that's probably kind of the crux or the complex nature of the question, and the need to balance objective and subjective assessments in order to kind of understand that. I know that there's a lot of ongoing work at NASA, specifically looking at EVA readiness to assess the degree to which someone's ready to perform that task. I know so that there's also been some research, actually, in one of the VN scores that Steve is leading, some research by, for example, Christine Fan Chang, that's looking at how to monitor a person. But I think that, you know, one of the big challenges there is to do this in a way that is going to be acceptable to the human, and thinking about how we can use these kinds of assessments as a way to provide more information to the person in order to really understand, like, what is their role, what is their readiness. I think there's another important dimension here, which is how can we dissect this problem across the different degrees of time criticality. So safety criticality is one dimension, but we already do spaceflight operations differently for sort of short time scales, such as launch and reentry. A lot of processes there are, you know, already integrating automated aspects and maybe one day autonomous aspects as well. But, you know, for much longer lead times, even if they're safety critical, if they're not time critical, I don't think any form of AI is an opportunity for us to cut corners or find shortcuts, that we still need to approach any of those aspects with the same degree of certainty, understanding of the process in the way that we currently do spaceflight operations. I guess the final point is maybe something that I think Steve has kind of already highlighted, but this idea of acceptability and decision authority, where, you know, if we don't maintain human engagement and specifically trust in their autonomous teammates, then people won't use those systems, or they might use them inappropriately or ineffectively. And so making sure that whatever we integrate is acceptable to the human and able to be adapted and integrated into their workflow rather than replacing the workflow, I personally think is important. So I will also hand the mic back.
Thank you very much, Allie. Next on my list is Dr. Sandra Stankovic. She is the director of the Human Performance Lab at Harvard Medical School and Mass General Hospital in Boston. Her research includes high-level human performance and behavioral health for individuals and teams in extreme and isolated working environments, particularly spaceflight, by optimizing crew selection, training, teaming, cooperation between humans and robotic and autonomous agents. So, Sandra, thanks for being here. Over to you.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Steve. And thank you again to you and to Mr. Abbey and all the organizers at the Baker Institute for having me on this great panel. I'm thrilled to be here and to get the opportunity to learn from all the amazing panelists. I think some of the themes we've already been talking about get to the heart of the biggest design challenges for enabling effective human automation teaming. Steve, the question you asked me had to do with presentation of information from the autonomous systems to crew members, and how these communication interfaces maybe need to adapt or be customizable. And I think that just highlights that inter-agent collaboration really hinges on not just cultivating trust, but on clear explainability on the part of the automation. The human needs to understand what the automation is doing and why, how it came to its conclusions, what it plans to do, what it thinks it did, and then what really happened. And these can be totally different. So promoting that kind of transparency through optimal information presentation is very critical. And I think designing these presentation approaches necessitates considering three central questions: what, when, and how. What is the right information? And probably what is the right granularity of information is a better question. What does a human actually need to know at any given moment about the system state and about the automation and its intention? That's really that when piece. How do these information needs interact with human tasks and change over time? For the how piece, I think we're really thinking about what are the right channels and modalities for communication. Is it visual? Is it auditory, haptic? Do presentation needs maybe change over time and adapt in response to dynamic situations? What about unexpected contingencies, and we'll be facing a lot more of those. There's going to be a lot of unanticipated problems and new failure modes as we move beyond low Earth orbit and operations start to become even more complex. So I think that's really where this customization piece comes in. Information presentation has to be customizable for humans to configure based on their needs. Maybe a design requirement should be something like building in levels of information presentation at preset granularities that a human can select, or maybe that shift at predetermined moments of transition between tasks and activities. So I'm imagining something like, really advanced version of the declutter levels on the space shuttle display, dynamic interfaces that present different levels of information density that a human can toggle between and control based on what is suiting their needs in a specific context. And that might vary based on the operator's proficiency and experience, or maybe situational factors like workload and task criticality. But ultimately, the crew needs to have a central role in defining how these interfaces are customized and tailoring that value to nuisance ratio. Because if that's poorly calibrated, automation just ends up creating more confusion and burden. And that's just really unfortunate. I think these questions start to become most interesting when we think about a paradigm shift from automation as a tool to automation as a teammate. This idea of collaborative teaming with automation, it's really exciting, but I think there's an implied bidirectionality in communication there that's important to consider when we think about translating this type of framework into human autonomy interaction. It's not just what the human needs to know about the autonomy, but what signals about the human does the automation need to be aware of? What inputs on the state of the operator, maybe like how fatigued they are, what tasks they're engaged in, what does the automation need to get to be able to present its information, the right information to the human at the right time. And in some ways, I wonder how achievable this teaming goal is, at least in the way that we understand teaming between humans. Human teams rely on members having a clear, shared understanding of their own roles, the roles of their teammates, the system state, the steps to execute a certain task at hand. But human teams improvise when necessary. They problem solve, they ideate. That requires an extraordinary amount of trust between team members. Whether or not it's achievable, I'm not even sure that's the appropriate goal to be striving for when working with automation. Do we maybe need to conceptualize an entirely different type of teaming model for human and automation that's not predicated on how humans work together? Does it look more like, I don't know, how a search and rescue team maybe works with a canine? I don't know. Maybe we need to, make some space for different kind of teaming models. Maybe the goal isn't collaboration, but coordination and cooperation. I realize I've met your question with more questions, but I think that just shows what an exciting problem space this is right now and how much room there is for innovation. I think we'll be seeing a lot of really interesting work in this arena in the coming years. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the thoughts of the other panelists and questions and inputs from the audience as well during the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandra. I'm busy writing while you speak, all of you, and I've already got 2 pages, so this is great. Let's go on to Dr. Jennifer Dow. Dr. Dow is calling in from Anchorage, Alaska. She practices emergency medicine at the Alaska Regional Hospital in Anchorage. She serves as the medical director for the National Park Service in the Alaska region. She works as medical director for Guardian Flight Alaska, Alyeska Ski Patrol, and the Alyeska Pipeline, which she just came back from a couple of days ago. She works closely with multiple guide and rescue services, ensuring their field teams have the knowledge and tools needed to manage remote emergencies. And thank you very much for being here, Dr. Dow. It's good to see you, and now I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and it's an honor to be part of this. So as introduced, my role for much of my work is to serve as the non-fatigued, non-hypoxic brain for my rescuers that are out in the field. Most of them are either at high altitude or in a hypothermic situation, given that a lot of the work that I do is in extreme environments. So when we look at autonomous systems, the autonomous system can fail if it doesn't understand illness and injury events. Illnesses and injuries don't follow an algorithm. They can occur, a broken leg can occur from a torsional injury, it can occur from blunt force, it can occur from just a glancing blow, and all of that can cause additional injury with it. So if we think about this, to differentiate between what might happen aboard a spacecraft during orbit, transit, anything on a non-Earth surface, has to be differentiated, I believe, between a critical illness and injury and something that is relatively simple. But the human needs to have the pattern recognition and integrate that into the autonomous system that can then give the human feedback as to what to look for. And an example for this particular case, I work with a number of paramedics, EMTs, and even those without letters after their name. We do a great deal of expanded scope of practice training, and much of that is pattern recognition. Recognition for when the patient's vital signs, gestalt, because much of medicine is actually gestalt and gut feeling, it's not just numbers. When that indicates that that patient is turning down a cliff, that their situation is getting significantly worse and what needs to be done. An algorithm, whether computer generated or human generated, can assist with leading somebody who's in the field to start looking for different problems or specific treatments. And we always address the ABCs or the CABCs, which is circulation or massive hemorrhage, looking at the airway, looking at breathing, and then looking at a shock state. And what can be done in order to mitigate those? Somebody in the field does not necessarily have to solve the actual injury or illness, but mitigate the effects of it. And this is where I think that having an algorithm, whether that is a computer-generated algorithm or a binder with printed pages that gives folks a patient care guideline, which is what we use in the field right now, it is an assistance to the decision-making. Not 100% coming from the human, but having those tools, and that's exactly what they are, tools, can help with going down the right pathway. Where we have some challenges with this, there are already some aided algorithms for patient care, is when there are hard stops. And in a situation like that, there needs to be an opportunity for the provider in the field to override any hard stops because a computer cannot see what's happening in front of them. A somewhat facetious example is when I am ordering a CT scan on a patient who has sustained head trauma, I get an appropriate use hard stop that I have to fill out. And one of the second questions is, has a CT scan already been ordered? No, I'm ordering it for the first time now. And this kind of algorithm that will shut things down. And it takes extra heartbeats and extra mind power on the part of the person in the field. So any automation needs to be simple. I won't say binary, yes, no, but there need to be very simple and easy to understand pathways. So it's somebody that doesn't have an MD, somebody that isn't a field medic, isn't a critical care nurse or critical care medic, can follow these steps in order to mitigate illness and injury and tell that individual or team that has all of those additional skills can get to the site. And I think this builds upon everything that's just been said about talking about the what, when, and how. And we're looking at the planning, how it can be used. I'm fascinated by how this is all, if you would, flowing into each topic that you've presented, each one of you have presented, and I really appreciate that. So those are my thoughts about how systems can improve a patient's outcome and improve the capacity of those that are providing the care in the field without creating additional frustration or mental strain. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. And this being the International Space Medicine Summit, it's really valuable to get the perspective of a lifelong medical care provider in extreme conditions, such as you. Now we're going to go over to Tamer Barkouki, who is a U.S. Air Force Reserve Special Warfare Pararescue Specialist, or PJ, He's a PhD student at UC Davis who's in his final year, getting ready to graduate in 2024. He's the chief scientist at the Center for Spaceflight Research at UC Davis, and his research includes AI explainability for human-robotic collaboration in spaceflight, exactly what we're talking about. So over to you, Tamer.
Thank you, Professor Robinson. Mic check really quick.
Loud and clear.
Oh, thanks. And thank you for inviting me to this distinguished panel. I kind of wish I'd gone first because this is getting harder and harder to follow up here. But so I think the question you wanted me to address was on how do we develop sufficient understanding with users working with machine learning and autonomous systems. I think the right answer is we ask those people, we ask the crew members, we ask the flight controllers working with them, what do they need the system to explain? And how do you get them involved in the design process and the testing early on, using some of the approaches that Dr. Anderson mentioned earlier. But from a research point of view, I like to look at autonomous systems as other people. What do we want other people to explain? And this is what the research community does, using how people explain answers to each other and what kind of questions are they generating in their heads when they're listening to an explanation, and how can we drive or hinder sufficient understanding. So to successfully explain a decision, one often includes answers to other questions that weren't asked, but they anticipate their counterpart is generating. For example, the what question, what are you doing, might also be really hiding the question of why are you doing that decision? Why aren't you doing something else? What are you going to do if this action fails? And what were the preconditions that led to this decision? What would happen if I changed some of those preconditions? What would the outcome be then? I think about the medical example. So for Dr. Dow's explanation on how we use these agents as assistants, if you were to use imaging in space, because you can't rely on having trained physicians at every station, and maybe that's the patient, you may want to use AI to help a non-trained physician or crew medical officer interpret imagery, and it may say, this is what I see, here's a fracture, or here's a clot. You may want an example of, okay, well, why isn't it something else? Show me an image of what some other injuries could be, and then I can make the decision that this is something that I can trust. Because I don't have that knowledge in my head. I haven't been trained that way as a non-physician. So all these questions are important to know in their own right for safety critical situations. Why not something else? What to do if it fails? But they just satisfy that curiosity that helps build sufficient understanding around the answer to the question that's being provided. This is sort of analogous to mode confusion in aviation, where the local actions of an autopilot might seem appropriate, but the system is actually in the wrong mode, and that's led to accidents when those actions start to deviate from what the crew members expected. They try to initiate a go-around, but the system wasn't set up for that, or they try to do a turn and it wasn't set up for that. So they were led down the wrong path by actions that seemed appropriate, but for the wrong reason. These other questions can help answer that and get out of that mode confusion. So we want to avoid that. And good teammates in operational settings can anticipate those questions. They don't need to talk much, but they can anticipate their teammates' questions and answer them or have answers ready for them so that they're synchronized in their responses to different actions and events. The good thing is these agents being algorithms, they can be run forward with these types of counterfactual and contrastive cases. We can just, okay, here's the algorithm that gave me the answer. Let's run it again with some deviations, either to the inputs or what input would have been required to get the answer that I'm actually interested in making sure that isn't the case. What remains to be done is choosing how and when to display that information so as to not overload the crew member. And Dr. Stankovich articulated this beautifully and gave some great examples. And I think that's really important. And what happens with crew members as they use systems over time, as they learn to trust them, as they learn to use them? Do they need less information over time? Can we anticipate that and make their job easier, or do we have to have them give them the knob to turn down that information as they become more familiar? But at the same time, being on the lookout for appropriate trust and not leading too far down misuse due to overtrust. How do we catch that? Is a kind of open research question as well. And lastly, I think it's just easy to forget that with the accessibility of machine learning in the consumer world, that these are engineered systems just like other systems. And while they are complex and they learn from data autonomously, we pick that data and we can't understand its statistics. We can look at what we're feeding into that model, make sure it's within the distribution that the model was trained in, and flag erroneous calls. Say, okay, well, actually, the model wasn't made for this. We can't use it in this situation to prevent unpredictable behavior. And I imagine crew members will need to be trained in these systems just like they are with other subsystems so that they know those limitations and they know how to work through those kinds of anomalies. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamer. Okay, next up is Dr. Annika Rollick. Annika is currently the director of engineering at Aurelia Institute, and there her work is focused on novel habitat technology development. She recently completed her PhD at CU Boulder, where her research focused on the design of next-generation deep space habitats in collaboration with the NASA Habitats Optimized for Missions of Exploration, the Space Technology Research Institute, a very large one, sponsored by NASA, and Annika played a key role in the development of our looking at these semi-autonomous habitats. So Annika, over to you. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Can you hear me all right? Great, thank you all. And thank you so much for having me here. It's really humbling and great to be kind of serving on a panel with all of you. And so most of you probably don't know what Aurelia Institute is. We are a nonprofit space architecture firm and outreach center that spun out of MIT a few years ago. And so we look at scaling up life in space through technology development. And this is a pretty big flip from what my PhD work was on, which was looking at HOME, which looked at deep space, really deep space missions and long duration spaceflight missions and autonomous systems and how they could be used for a highly trained, highly selected group of astronauts who have a very specific mission they're looking to fulfill. And now my work has flipped a little bit and looks at kind of an inverse of that, where we look at broadening the astronaut or spaceflight participant pool for near Earth missions, like in LEO, to build habitats that would serve as laboratories, as research platforms. And so we don't look just at space tourism, but we look at expanding space to scientists who rely on microgravity for critical research like protein crystallization, biologics, and are probably coming from a different background than kind of the trained astronaut corps. And so we are looking into technology that's really moving away from thinking of habitats from a purely survival standpoint and a mission accomplishment standpoint towards one that is accommodating a wider range of spaceflight participants. And so I think a theme that I've seen other speakers here address is that autonomy is kind of about bridging gaps in capabilities and filling gaps that maybe certain select groups of people can't do on their own. And so Mike, I'm trying to lead towards the question Steve asked me, which is if we can learn to assess an onboard astronaut's physical and psychological state in real time, should there be standards to measure these against? And I come at this question kind of from a combination of my current work and from a sports perspective, which is, I think, it is unfair to consider everyone as a comparison to some standard or some kind of set goal endpoint here. And so I think of like a concussion test. Like I think if we're looking at measuring psychological and physiological states in real time, it should be kind of within each person, right? So it's a comparison to their baseline either before launch or at some standpoint. And so to give it a reductive example, John McFall was an ESA astronaut that was recently selected as the first para astronaut. And it's wrong to necessarily compare his performance to another astronaut who is not a para astronaut. And so the baseline has to be within each person. And likewise for spaceflight participants who come from a research background and aren't necessarily, they might come from Harvard Medical School or they might come from Pfizer, and they're going to space to do the work they do really well, right? To do almost like lab science in space. And they might not necessarily have the same physical performance as a trained astronaut. And so we do a lot of work into thinking of that paradigm and asking these researchers kind of what they would want, and also trying to research what would be safe enough from a kind of institutional space medicine perspective. And I think there needs to be more thought put into that, into how we determine what is good enough performance, what is low enough degradation from a physical standpoint for people who are not highly trained astronauts from that select background. And so to kind of bring it back to a concussion example, once you get hit in the head while you're playing sports, you take a concussion test again and you compare it to your own baseline. And so in the paradigm I work with, that's kind of what we're looking at is kind of within each person. And then the follow-up question Steve asked was, should this be done on board in mission control or flight medicine or in partnership? And I think that really depends on your mission. It depends on your players you have going on in the architecture and who wants to call the shots. But I think in general, especially with deep space, we need to put more trust in the crew on board, and we need to make sure that they feel like they have the authority to make those decisions and take their health and psychological health into their own hands as well. So there's a really tough balance to strike there. I think I've gone on a little bit too long, but yeah, I'll pass the mic back to you, Steve. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Annika. Now over to Captain Jim Weatherby. Wex is a retired U.S. Navy officer, naval aviator, test pilot, aerospace engineer, and NASA astronaut. Veteran of 6 space shuttle missions, and is the only American to have commanded 5 spaceflight missions. And Wex, it's great to have you back on the panel and to see my fellow MaxQ bandmate once again.
So thanks for having me again. Quick mic check. Can you hear me?
We can always hear the drummer.
Thanks. So my 2 questions were, how do we develop and validate design principles, and how do we assess the risks? Fortunately, we have a lot of experience in this in the past. In the early 90s, I was responsible for designing and executing the test program for the proposed auto-land system on the space shuttle. And our conclusion, based on the simulator, was to not perform that test because the risk was deemed too great. The problem was trying to convince the executives and decision makers to not do the test. The easier part was designing the test and conducting it. The harder part was convincing people that we shouldn't do it. In the modern era, I fear that there are 2 problems with testing and executing or using autonomous systems. The first is that we have disparate companies that are developing autonomous systems, and NASA, I really think, should be involved more in the development of these programs and the design and the test and integrating them. I'll get to the second problem here in a second. In the past couple of years on this forum, my 2 continuing themes have been, we need to use autonomous systems where they are beneficial and use humans where they are better than the autonomous systems. And the second in the continuing themes I have is we should develop principles of automation as we design and test autonomous systems. I'm happy to report, since we last met, I sent my copy of the principles to Reed Weissman, the commander of the Artemis II mission, as they're getting ready to launch back to the moon here later this year, or maybe next year. Next year. And I also sent a copy to Mark Stuckey, who works for Blue Origin now. He's responsible for the cockpit layout, the piloting displays, and the controls in the lander that Blue Origin will use later on, had been selected by NASA. So again, the first problem was, I think we need to have oversight of the development of all these disparate programs. The second problem is quite challenging. It's what I call the search for the truth. When Shep and I and you, Steve, when we flew the systems on the space shuttle long ago, they're very complicated systems, but it was easy to memorize what we needed to do and to train. But the real problem was the search for the truth. Two things that astounded me in the space shuttle program. I had memorized something in a critical system during landing, and 10 years after I memorized it, I realized it was wrong. I had seen the same explanation of the system in 5 different technical manuals, and I later learned that it was simply duplicated from the first erroneous statement of how the system operated. And autonomous systems are going to make this challenge even more difficult as the autonomous system operates. The human is a little bit farther removed from what is the real situation of operations and the autonomous system. So knowing the truth is going to be quite challenging. The other quick example, I won't belabor it, but 7 seconds after liftoff on my first flight, I had to make a critical decision on whether or not the autopilot system was operating properly, and whether or not to disengage and fly manual or turn it over to a backup autonomous system. And I was astounded to learn 7 seconds after liftoff, we had a 2-second lag in the displays. And it really is creating quite difficult challenge for humans when the autonomous systems aren't presenting true and valid information to the human. So just in conclusion, the first biggest problem is we need to have centralized organization that is overseeing the development of the autonomous systems, and I think NASA needs to take a bigger role in that. And And second, if we're expected to make decisions with the autonomous systems, we really have to have the ability to assess not only the operational situation, but also assess the accuracy of what the autonomous system is doing. And those are going to be quite challenging in the future. So thank you very much for having me again this year.
Thank you, Wick, and thank you, everybody. Okay, those were fantastic opening statements. I think we have corralled the issue of autonomy in human spacecraft really, really well here. There are many more questions and concerns than there are answers, and it's interesting. World of autonomous systems driven by learning software that can learn from examples and turn into models that are useful for, hopefully useful for predicting near-term behavior in a state of a system, is advancing so fast that I think we have to sort of take these questions really seriously. We're not, the answers to these questions are not advancing at the rate that the software that we're trying to use is. So at this point, I'd like to ask our audience to chime in with questions. And I've got some questions for you, panel, too. But since this is your opportunity to ask this panel of experts anything about autonomous systems and human spacecraft. So if I may open it to the floor.
Just 1 second.
Thanks, Richard.
Making you run everywhere.
Richard's the runner, okay.
He's Richard the runner. So I just wanted to ask what you guys think the integration between training and automation, or not automation, but autonomy will be. In other words, how are we going to prepare our crews for autonomous systems? Each of you kind of touched on it in different ways, but wanted to dive into that a little bit further and, see what you think some of the unique challenges will be with that. And part of that, it was interesting. Somebody mentioned getting to know autonomous systems as a crew member. So, what level of detail do we need to understand that? And that gets back to Captain Weatherby's statement about, what's the truth and how far do you need to train that before you go into a system and you can really be able to trust that system.
Could I just jump in with a comment to that?
You bet.
One of the issues that's underlying all this is that as these autonomous systems and AI and machine learning become more advanced, these responses are not determinate. In other words, you cannot go back and retrace how the machine made that decision. So how do you train how the machine arrived at the conclusion? I mean, this is a huge gulf that we are faced with. So I just leave that as a question.
Yeah, to build on that, also, if a machine makes a decision and does something and the human decides to intervene, how does the human intervene? And there's huge training implications on knowing the right thing to do based on what Shep said. If we don't really know why the system did what it did, we might be doing the wrong thing. So the autonomous systems are intended to decrease the workload for the human. That's one of the functions or one of the advantages. But unfortunately, it really increases the training workload and the mental workload during operations because we are expected to do different things, to monitor the system and assess its performance and know when to take over, know how to take over. And these are all things that are going to make the job really challenging in the future unless we start working towards improving the training and doing different kind of training in the future.
Tamara, what's your opinion on the current state of deterministic behavior of a autonomous system, semi-autonomous system?
Well, these approaches come in all shapes and sizes. So there's, machine learning includes linear regression, for example, which is extremely traceable. You can look at every data point and you have a line. It's a slope and an intercept, right? So you can tell exactly where that prediction came from, all the way to large language models where there's no chance in the world to ever figure out exactly why it came up with its output. So and everything in between. So I think the point is valid, but one approach is just don't use those more advanced models. You may take a hit on performance. You may have that higher workload on the crew member to do the manual task. So use it where it's appropriate. Use it where it improves the workflow. So maybe part of the first steps are to try different types of machine learning models and see where that breakpoint is, where now it's more of a burden. There's more confusion. There's more mistrust or distrust. There's more apprehension, and you don't go further than that. I mean, the human spaceflight has been occurring without these systems. So it should only be used where they improve safety, when they improve performance. That's one thing. I think another is back to what I said in my opening remark, is that you may not know exactly what led to a prediction, but you can understand what led to not having other predictions. So if this is being used to plan a path for a mobile habitat on the moon, the path is the answer, but there are other components of that could come in as saying, okay, well, I didn't choose this path, which might be shorter, or it might be flatter, or it might be smoother, but there are these large craters, these large boulders that I see. If they're not there, the human can then say those are wrong and replan. But at least it gave you the justification for why it shows something that may seem suboptimal initially, that then the human can come in with better generalizability and say, nope, that was glare, that's a different texture of sand, that's not a rock. It just wasn't covered in the training set, so the model had no way of knowing that. But it highlighted the portion of that alternative that it chose not to do, so that the human could then apply our more flexible brain on the problem. So I think that's an approach to using those more complex models is again, pulling out more information than just the answer and just the input data, but also trying these other outcomes and see why they're not valid or why they might be more valid for the human to
Hey, Steve, I'd like to throw in another dimension to this, what Jim Weatherby said about his 7 seconds. How fast does the automated or the autonomous system have to work? How quick do you need an answer? And these are some really important considerations depending upon what you're doing.
Yeah, that's a very important caution to think about. The original question also was talking about, I think, sort of the costs and benefits of training crew members to actually effectively use this new technology.
If you're talking about controlling a rocket engine, 20 milliseconds is a long time.
You bet. I totally agree. And so it sort of makes sense. I mean, what Tamara was saying is don't use the wrong tool in the wrong place. That makes a lot of sense. I think we've always tried to do that in spaceflight. But I wanted to ask Jen Dow to, you brought up the idea of using tools that can help people in the field make intelligent decisions. And how do people, what are the implications in training for people to use these new tools, especially if they're experienced in older ways? The tools are evolving. So now you've got to train somebody who's experienced to use something new. I think you're a good example with a ton of experience of saving lives in extreme environments. But the tools that are available to you are changing. So how does that affect training, and what are the potential downfalls or costs of that?
One of the things that we do when we are setting up training scenarios is we do integrate, whether it's your clinical practice guidelines or a new device, and we use it in a training situation first, and we try to set up the most extreme, ridiculous scenario where it might be used to almost attempt for failure, and then also the most realistic, and then we will ask the teams that we're working with to develop their own scenario that will address their own concerns. I'm worried that this device won't work in this setting. So we'll set up that setting to the best that we can and use a training scenario with that. By doing it in that way, we try to force failure so we can see where a system, where an algorithm isn't going to work, and potentially revise it, redirect it, or just decide that has to be scrapped. And then we also set up scenarios which address the concerns of the providers, of the rescue teams, so that they can say, hey, I was worried about this. We designed a scenario where this worked. I know how I can make this system work in this setting. I'm comfortable with this. And that's part of the integration. I think it was brought up using automation as a crew member, as a resource, but not as a leader of the team. And that's what we do.
That's an important distinction, yes. I think it's interesting you brought something up. Is part of the training is seeing the system fail. What can't the system do, and what does that look like? We will. I'm going to come back to that word trust here because everyone has brought it up. But that certainly is an aspect of it. But at this point, I want to go back to our audience and see if there's any other questions from the floor, please. And please introduce yourself when you ask a question, just in case we don't know you.
Just 1 second.
I appreciate how fast you run, Richard.
I helped him out a little bit. Hello, I'm Mary Van Balen. I brought this comment up yesterday, and I think it's maybe a general comment and maybe some comments back from the panelists as well. We were talking about autonomous medical systems and what were needed for autonomy in medical systems yesterday. It was a brief part of our conversation at the end of the day. And as the human system risk manager at NASA, I'm struck by the thought that we look at it a lot from the human piece and the medical piece within our community, but I'm really thought with the fact that the way a lot of our operations are done right now are done with heavy reliance on the ground. And so this change to move to autonomous systems is really going to require some of a cultural change and so forth. And I think Shep had some comments back to me yesterday or back in our conversation about there's been places where we have allowed autonomy and how it has worked really well. And so I'm kind of interested in some of those thoughts other panelists might have along those lines, because I think this is an opportunity to learn for that as we try to make that culture change.
Okay, we're talking crew autonomy here, which I think is obviously a very important thing. I'm actually the chief scientist for a NASA small research institute of 7 institutes, different teams that are looking on exactly that, human capabilities on autonomous missions. But I know that Allie, you've thought a lot about crew autonomy and self-performance assessment. What are your thoughts on what Mary has brought up here?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mary. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is that we have talked a little bit already about this mismatch between system capabilities, human expectation, and ultimately how that translates into meaningful performance changes. We just wrapped up a study actually looking at point of care ultrasound and looking at skill retention for people over long periods of time, where we had a cohort of individuals who had autonomous tools to facilitate that image acquisition and another cohort that didn't have those autonomous tools. And, the underlying premise between that, for that experiment was that the AI would facilitate that image acquisition in such a way that they could be more autonomous in doing a clinical diagnostic. But ultimately, that because there are so many specific dimensions of actually performing that care, that you cannot mitigate performance decrements at every step unless you have kind of thought through all of that. So, for example, we were doing bladder image. We were imaging bladders and looking at volume, and we didn't see the autonomous system helping people, say, identify just baseline anatomy at all. But then once we were able to then look at that and see how AI facilitated better actual image acquisition, and then finally being able to say, oh, this individual would have bladder retention, that because the tool was not specifically geared towards anatomy identification, that although there's this idea that, oh, the AI is going to facilitate crew autonomy, that it can't, unless it's specifically geared towards every single step in the chain that is required in order to actually do clinical care, that you can't necessarily over rely on the AI to kind of facilitate the entire process. So I think that that's one comment I would make there. I think given that it's specifically geared towards clinical applications, I'm sure Jennifer also has some comments there to add. But yeah, I think that again, speaks it to some of the previous things we've already hit on, which is that truly understanding the underlying capability versus the actual need, and ensuring that you have a coherent match there so the human's expectations are set.
Thank you, Ellie. Great question. In continuing with questions from the audience, I see that John Clark is on board with us today. John, I know you're supposed to ask the questions, but I'm going to call on you because I'm a professor now, and this is the kind of thing I do. So I wonder, John, if you have some thoughts or opinions about this topic in general. And I know you do.
Well, Steve, just for FYI, I'm a professor now too, so I can ask you some too.
Oh no!
No, you know,
Clash of the Titans.
I always like to look at other analog environments, and this issue of human automation integration is a very hot topic in the airline world. And so, first off, I'd say go back and look at all the failures where an automation system erroneously did something, and how the crew responded. And just to get a catalog of that might be of value in seeing, because you need to have real world incidents and close calls to give you a perspective of where you need to be looking. Automation systems, I mean, you fly, aircraft, I do too. You look at what we have now in the cockpit display arena, you can see where other aircraft are real time. You can see weather in the near real time. It's changed our situational awareness. So there's no question that going back to the way we learned to fly, decades ago is so much safer now. And so how do we continue to make this transition? And the other thing is sometimes these systems fail at the most inopportune time. So you always have to be ready to go back to the Mark I eyeball and your own self to figure it out. And I'm sure Jim Weatherby, he probably has some really good insight into some of this too. Is you look at other industries that have integrated automation systems to enhance safety and operability. But to me, it's looking at the aerospace industry, the aviation airline industry, for automation shortfalls, and say, okay, this has happened. How do you generalize it to some of the future operations that we're going to be doing?
So 2 quick comments to follow on. Thanks, Dr. Clark. The first is a great example was Air France 447, where 228 people tragically died. There was a problem with the automated system. But the real issue was that the crew was, and by the way, the Accident Investigation Board did not ask the right questions. The crew relied on the automated system all the way to water impact. Essentially, they were trained to pull full back on the stick if they thought the vehicle was stalling, because the computer is much better at seeking and maintaining optimum angle of attack. And so the humans, when we started getting automated fly-by-wire systems, were trained to simply pull back on the stick, which was the command to the computer to achieve optimum angle of attack. Well, that was the wrong thing to do in this instance, but they relied on their training. The other quick example, a generic example in the oil and gas industry, too many of the operators in the boardroom are not trained to expect failures. And you mentioned failures will occur at the worst possible time. And by the way, that's not a coincidence. The time that you need the system is when it's under the most stress, and that's when the failures occur. But I was astounded to learn that they always seem to believe the indications they were seeing on the displays, and that has created many tragedies throughout history.
Wise words. And I'm glad I asked John for a question. I knew I would get a good one. It is 15 minutes after the hour. That's 1 hour. I guess I'll ask the organizers, may we keep going?
Mm-hmm. Pardon? You can keep going.
Okay, awesome. I'm not even sure how to ask this. I mean, we think about this every day in the research environment that I work in. I know you do too, when we're thinking about automation, and that is this word trust, which everybody has a different idea about it. But since everybody here mentioned it in some way, talking about worry, talking about trust, talking about understanding between autonomous systems and the humans who are, to some degree, depending on them, to do a better job, it seems to me that we are challenged with making the concept of trust explicitly a part of our day-to-day operational environment. So I guess what I mean is we need to communicate about it. We need to have ways to assess it. And several of you have actually been involved in doing trust assessment within the aerospace human systems integration environment. And so I think I'll ask Sandra if you would first address this very thorny and hard to define question. Take it out of my hands.
It's a great question, Steve. There's a lot to consider. It makes me, I think going back to some of the earlier questions that have come up and the themes we've discussed about failure modes and cultural shifts in training, it's easy to cultivate trust when you know a predictable series of actions that your counterpart or your colleague might perform. It's easy to kind of pin trust against expectations. But when we move into these scenarios where, we're looking at very complex operations, we can't even predict all the failure modes, let alone train for them. And now there'll be a shift into training for problem solving, training for how to generate solutions in real time. That's a lot to ask of, a human to trust a system to do something generative like that. So maybe there are ways that, a system can present options to you and an operator can have final decision authority. But even then, there's a lot of trust that's, you're relying on trusting those solutions as being viable, being safe. I liked a lot of the points that Tamara made about, tracing, kind of delineating how the automation reach the conclusions that it's presenting to you. But it's very contextually dependent. I think sometimes you'll want to be able to do that tracing with a much higher level of ability to vet the information that the automation is using to generate its own conclusions. I have no answers for this, Steve, but I think it's a fascinating set of questions. I wonder if we can look at, how humans cultivate trust in each other. I think a lot of that comes from repetition and reliability, consistency, seeing, I'll trust you as my teammate if we've had a successful experience working before, if I've watched you demonstrate good judgment, good problem solving skills, accountability. So, maybe there's something in our trust paradigm, in our training paradigm that we need to build in of just, more exposure to working with the automation, to understanding its capabilities and more importantly, its limitations.
Hey, Steve, could I ask Captain Weatherby a very related question?
Oh, yeah.
So, Jim, you practice many times in the simulator to deal with computer aberrations, shall we say. And there are many circumstances where the 4 computers controlling the shuttle on ascent, 2 of them decided you had to go right, and the other 2 were unhappy with that and they wanted to go left. And your responsibility was to either to decide which pair of computers was right and kill the other 2, or press that big red button that was going to take you to a backup system. So what was going through your mind when you were doing that?
Yeah, so great question. Another example along those lines, we had a real world example when I was approaching the Russian space station for the first time, and I was supposed to fly to within 10 meters, not 1 centimeter closer. And we had 4 different independent systems that were giving us ranging information, and we had essentially, as Shep described, a 2-on-2 split. 2 agreed and said we were closer, and 2 disagreed and said we were farther. It brings about one of the most important principles in operations is verification. We're talking a lot about trust now, but how do you verify which is correct? And the most powerful way to verify is to use independent verification or dissimilar verification, use an independent system. By the way, another great example was Hubble Space Telescope that had the flawed mirror. People erroneously think the mirror was incorrectly ground, but it was the most precisely ground mirror in the history of grinding mirrors. The problem was when they went to test the spherical aberration or lack of it in the mirror, they used the same system that grinded the mirror to verify that it was ground properly, and that system had an error in it. So what they should have used was a dissimilar system to verify. To come back to that example, you know, and sometimes in operations, as we were approaching the Russian space station, the answer is not which is the truth, but the answer in that instance became which is the safer of the two options. And so what we chose to use were the two systems that showed we were closer than the other two, because if they were wrong and we really were too far away, at least I didn't breach the 10-meter limit. If they were correct, then it was great. Turned out Mike Full was able to sleuth out before we got close where the error was, and it turned out to be a human error in the system. But to sum up, you know, we're talking about trust and verification. It might be, as we design autonomous systems in the future, we might have to have an independent system that is assessing the accuracy of the autonomous system and the human being. Analogous to the example that Shep talked about with the primary computers and the backup computers assessing each other, but you still have to have the human there to make the final judgment. And I'll close by saying one final thing. The autonomous systems don't have a fear of death, and that's one of the advantages of the human, is that we do have a fear of death, and we'll generally make the right decisions.
Well, it's one of the things I always appreciated about the way NASA ran the shuttle program and the astronaut office developed crew practices, more than procedures, but practices, was that the fallback when the complex systems looked like they were not giving the right answers, I won't say quite failing, but giving questionable answers. That's always the worst case, right? It's when you get an answer back and you go, wait a minute, is that right? You know, I'd rather see a big red X, because then you know what to do. And I remember approaching the space station in the shuttle, and I was the guy in charge of the sensors for that same sort of thing. We were getting very close to docking, and the very nice laser range finders in the shuttle, they started giving us questionable answers. This didn't look so good. And we had a handheld laser rangefinder. Anyway, we dropped back to the simplest possible case, which was using the TV cameras and a piece of plastic over the screen to measure how far away with steady arranging the docking fixture was. But the only reason we could do that was because, against the recommendations of the training people, during training, we had always done that. So we were constantly running that as a backup, just in case these automated systems failed, which had never happened at that time. But then they did. And so rather than start a new method when we're a couple of meters away from the space station, we just quit using the ones that weren't working and continued using the backup ones. And that taught me a lot about concurrent backups, is what I would call that.
Yeah. I might ask a quick question before we close, in case we run out of time. I know there are people from NASA there. Is anyone at NASA interested in receiving this draft set of principles for automation systems for both the human and the automated systems? And also, is there anyone at NASA that can tell us whether or not they are providing good enough oversight or integration of all the disparate companies that are developing autonomous systems, or do they have a role in making sure that these systems are going to be following the principles of automation? I'm happy to send these principles, as I've done to Blue Origin and Reed Wiseman, but I'm wondering if there's anyone at NASA that could see value in receiving the principles of automation and even improving them and making them better as we go into the future. Because I think it's a very important issue that we're all talking about today.
I read
Jim,
those
following
principles
up
as
on that, I have
homework for this.
oh, sorry, Steve.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, I have a follow-up question I'm so interested in your set of principles, and I'm wondering, what kind of a pathway do you see to translating principles into requirements or certification standards? Like, what are your thoughts on like how we can maybe leverage some guidelines to actually implement better design practices?
I think the world expert is Captain Shepard, who can probably answer that. If you start with principles and then you design the standards from those principles, and from those standards you have practices, and you get down to what the crew is doing. But he can answer that much better than I can.
Yeah, early on in the space station, we tried to kind of list what would be the critical functions for the whole station to do as a station. And pretty near the top of the list is don't do anything that's going to endanger the crew. So you kind of put depressurization and collision and fire and a few other things right at the top of the list. But that hierarchy of things that are important are somewhat context dependent. It depends on what you're doing. And I have yet to see a program, an aerospace program like this, the space station program, designed with, starting from that point. I think it'd be a tremendously good academic exercise for engineering and aerospace students to try and do that, because I think the community needs it.
Well, that's motivating to those of us in academia, and couldn't agree more.
Well, first of all, thank you, Steve, and all the panel, and Wex and Shep. It's a really great discussion because, as Steve knows, we have one of those research contracts at Texas A&M on trust and the virtual assistant that we call the Good HAL. Her name's Daphne, but that's all about trying to understand trust. But I have a thought for Jim in terms of how to get some feedback on this. And, Nancy's joined our faculty, Dr. Nancy Curry-Gregg, and she's teaching a lot of courses right now that relate to safety and so forth. And, she came from the NASA Engineering Safety Center, NESC, which tries to take an agnostic look at a lot of different things. They might be willing to give you that kind of audience that you're looking for. And if you want to go through Nancy or just send it directly to them, that might be an option.
As homework for setting up this panel, I reread Captain Weatherby's principles, so I can vouch for. If you want to be fascinated and a little bit fired up, you should read these principles. I think we're getting close to being done. I want to put Annika on the spot, if you don't mind. Annika, your PhD dissertation was called Guiding Principles for Prioritizing the Use of Emergent Technology towards Self-Reliant Deep Space Habitats. What would be your number one guiding principle based on your research?
Man, that is one question. That is a great question. This is hopefully counts as one. I think clarity with what you are trying to do with the technology is the biggest thing. It can't be a catch-all for a bunch of different problems. It just has to have a very specific problem it is trying to be a solution to. So that is my one recommended guiding principle. Yeah.
Hey, Steve, could I ask Sandra one question here?
Yeah.
So I think you touched on some of the human interaction of the machines and how that's displayed. The question is really, do you think that there's a cultural bias to that, in the sense that our relationship, particularly with the Russians and their space program, has shown us many different ways to display things, to take training, to understand what machines are doing, which I think in a larger context is really valuable. And we tend to be very parochial about how we design things because they look like the things that we know how to design. But in a larger scope, that might not be the right answer. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a wonderful suggestion. Thank you for bringing that up. I think I'm very much in a frame of mind right now of making space for new possibilities, new ways to conceptualize how displays look when we present information, how to make it, to your point, culturally contextualized and appropriate, what these teaming relationships look like. So that's a wonderful consideration. I haven't actually seen that really flagged much in the literature, and I think that's something we can definitely focus on more. And it really, I think, grounds us in thinking about how important incorporating the user in the design process is, and making sure that, you know, we consider the context not just of what the crew members are doing, what their tasks are, but, you know, what their background, their training, these social relationships that are, you know, in the background of the work that's happening. So that's a great suggestion. Thanks for bringing that up.
It is clear to me that the people who are going to solve these complex and multi-threaded issues are the people who are probably in college now. And so, Allie, I wanted to ask you, as an accomplished professor in aerospace engineering, how do we prepare students to think about these problems?
Yeah, so I know I'm not the only one in the room who adopts this philosophy, but we integrate a lot of undergraduate students into our lab for research purposes. One of the challenges I know that many professors often face is that there is a lot of students come into aerospace programs because they are motivated by rockets, spacecraft, airplanes. And then when you teach them how to computer program, there is a certain subset that really, lights their fire, and they are so motivated and interested, and then they want to take machine learning classes. And then a lot of our students end up going into aerospace software. But there's another subset of students who are going to be required to use computer-based tools because you can't solve some of these complex problems analytically, where you have to sort of sell them on the value of that. I think that there's a lot of novel ways where teaching people how to do statistics and especially machine learning are basically adapting the ways in which curriculums are getting students to understand those fundamental underlying principles, but then also to shift how we think about training people how to code and integrating that more meaningfully into the work that they're doing, so that way they can inherently see the value and have to fight through that one embedded bug somewhere that's so annoying and impossible to find. So I think that there is a lot of work on engineering education, and specifically integrating both statistics as well as computer programming into aerospace programs. The other thing I will say there is that it is incredibly beneficial, because even if they are not the individuals who are developing and integrating these systems into the habitat or whatever aerospace vehicle they are ultimately going to work on, if they have that fundamental understanding when they interact with those systems, whether they become, operators in mission control or they get hired as astronauts, that they at least have that academic background and understanding to be more equipped to understand the capabilities and limitations of what is developed in the systems they're actually interacting with.
Thank you, Allie. To close us out today, I'm going to go around the table and ask each of you to say the one thing that you want us all to remember on the topic of autonomy in human spaceflight. I want to go away and say, well, each of you said, whatever you do, don't forget this. So, Shep, let's start with you.
I would say less is more. I think simplicity is something that we often overlook.
Thank you. Tamer?
Just, I would push on getting the user community involved from the initial design, even selecting the data set, not just how the interface works, but everything from the full life cycle, and iterate on their feedback that way.
Thank you. Dr. Dow, Jen?
I would suggest that these systems be integrated into training and that scenarios include failure and include concerns that the users would have, that those are addressed and trained to.
Okay, Annika?
Yeah, to kind of build on that, just I think literacy and familiarity with systems and really finding the edge of their capabilities so that the operators have a sense of when they can make the call and understand the limitations of the system they're working with.
Sandra?
I was going to say Tamer's point, so thanks for bringing that one up. I think only use the automation when it makes sense and is appropriate. You know, humans are good at some things, automation's good at other stuff, and we need to be able to be clear about that distinction.
Ellie?
I think my takeaway message would be that the promise is high, but maybe the readiness is low, and the slow and steady integration so we can build confidence into implementing in, say, some of those less safety critical aspects where we have a greater degree of certainty from ground-based validation would be a helpful approach.
Thank you. And I have learned in life to give Wex the last word.
So thanks. I would say use humans where humans are best and use autonomous systems where they are best. But when you design autonomous systems following the proper principles, make sure you include the human as probably the most important part of the autonomous system.
Well, I will summarize this panel and the various messages we've heard, both of hope, promise, and caution, as we won't be able to use these systems wisely to increase effectiveness and safety without including the spectrum of experience. So people who have been in the business since long before autonomous systems were available, to brand new people who don't have any experience whatsoever and still in school and are going to invent the new systems. Including that whole spectrum, to me, is the only way we're really going to make good progress on this. And so that's what we've done today, a little microcosm of that. I want to thank our panel and especially thank our sponsors, the Baker Institute, Mr. Abbey, Bonnie Dunbar, and all the audience. Thanks a lot for spending your time with us on a Saturday.
Thank you, Steve, and thank the panel. I think that was an excellent discussion and certainly gives us a lot to think about relative to what's coming up relative to Artemis and Gateway and going back to the moon. There's a lot of considerations that were discussed that we need to think about as we look at how we implement those systems and integrate them. And I surprised we didn't get any acceptance of Jim Weatherby's offer of the principles on the part of the NASA, but hopefully someone is listening and will ask for those because they're certainly needed. So thank you all, and this was our last panel, and I hope you all enjoyed the last 2 days, and I think it all in all was a great summit. And let me give Bonnie and Jeff Sutton and Richard a chance to get up here and say a few words.
Well, I'd like to thank Mr. Abbey for making this possible and for all of the participants in the panels and the moderators and the attendees, because as I said earlier, this summit works because of the expertise of the people up there, but also the expertise in the audience. It takes a lot of work to do this. We really appreciate the Baker Institute for Public Policy and all of their staff, the AV people. They've done a good job. This is our first blended meeting. there've been a few bumps, but we've made a few notes on how to improve things going forward. One of the other things I'll mention is that we have a planning committee that does a lot of work, includes Leroy Chow and Jeff and Mr. Abbey and some others. If you have topics that you'd like us to consider, certainly feel free to do that. If you know individuals that haven't been invited, that should be invited, let us know about that also. And I will remind everybody one more time that these things are going to be online usually. So if you think people need to see some of these panels, particularly those who are in educational institutions and have students and things, make sure you do that.
Well, I too also wanted to thank everyone. One of the things that I think we often overlook, and because of the pandemic, we were not able to interact in person, and it's just so wonderful seeing so many colleagues and friends, people who've been our mentors and our colleagues and our students at this meeting. And thank you very much, Mr. Abbey. As always, you spearheaded this for all these years, and it's great to see you here. And we're really honored to be part of this this great summit and to continue the legacy here at the Baker Institute for Public Policy.
I would also like to extend my thank you and appreciation to Mr. Abbey and to Richard and Jeff and to all of the organizers, the organizing committee. And as a representative of Texas A&M University, just to again echo the words of our chancellor that we intend to be full in on exploration and space. And I'd like to remind everyone that these types of conferences do require sponsors. And we are very honored to be a financial sponsor, but certainly if you have an interest in doing so, please contact Mr. Abbey so that we can continue to put these on and go back to our 3.5-day conference that we used to have. And that includes more food too, right? So thank you once again. It's been a real pleasure.